Good day and welcome to the Sun Life Financial webinar. Today's conference is being recorded. At this time, I'd like to turn the conference over to James Slotnick, AVP, Broker Education and Advanced Markets. Please go ahead, sir.
Hey, John, thanks thanks for the introduction. Thank you all very much for taking some time out of your day. We have over 500 people that have dialed in. We still have are listening on your computers this afternoon. And obviously, it's a big day. November 4th yesterday, we certainly saw some things that we hadn't expected. Certainly everyone predicted that we would see some gains by the Republicans in both the House and the Senate. But I don't think even maybe the most optimistic Republican strategists thought that they would pick up as many seats as they did yesterday. And as you're thinking about the fourth quarter, it's the busiest time of year for everybody on the call today. I know that you're meeting with your clients. You're thinking about employee benefit planning. What does this mean? That now we have a Republican-controlled Senate and a Republican-controlled House? They're good questions, and really that's what we're going to dive into today. What can you talk to your clients, to your employees about tomorrow, based on what happened on the election yesterday, and really make them understand what could or couldn't happen as we go into 2015 and 2016? So I want to dive right into the call. What we're going to do today is I divide this up into three parts. And the parts are, first, we're going to look at what happened yesterday. We're going to dive into those midterm results and really talk about what happened, what was expected, what wasn't, and maybe why what happened actually did happen. And then we're going to take a look ahead. We're going to look towards 2016. And it's not just the 2016 presidential election that's going to matter for the future of the ACA, but it's also the 2016 congressional races that really are going to have a huge impact on what the Affordable Care Act looks like into the future. And so looking at what just happened yesterday, we'll talk a little bit about what we think could happen in all those races in 2016. Because make no mistake, today, November 5th, the 2016 presidential cycle and really the entire 2016 campaign has begun. And then lastly, we're going to go right to that controversial issue. What does yesterday mean for the future of the ACA? And we'll talk about some strategies the Republicans are already talking about. We'll talk about some things that maybe you heard on MSNBC or Fox News last night and really dive into what are the changes that potentially could happen tomorrow to the Affordable Care Act, and then again as we look past 2016. Now, the way we have this set up today, a few of you or most of you are listening over the web, so make sure all the sound should be coming through your computer. The way that we're going to do questions is there's an ability for you to type in questions through the screen. I can see them. I'll take some questions during the presentation, but I have some time at the end to address questions. And you will get a copy of everything that I go through today. All the slides you'll have in a PDF form so that you can use and look at after the call. But again, any questions that you have, you will have to type them in, and I'll be sure to take as many of those as I can. So let's dive into really what happened yesterday, and certainly for those of you that have seen me speak to you this year, this slide looks familiar. This was what was up for grabs yesterday, particularly in the Senate. And we're not going to spend too much time on the House. Republicans picked up a number of seats in the House. Looks like it's going to be 10 or 11 seats. Some of the votes are still coming in. But the Republicans have that healthy majority in the House. They had it on November 3rd, and they have it on November 5th. So really what happened in the House is, yes, they picked up some more seats, but it's this slide that really we were really trying to figure out what was going to happen yesterday. Of the 36 seats that were up for grabs in 2014, how many of them would the Republicans be able to take? And again, when you look at the map geographically, it's understandable just how well the Republicans did because many of the seats that were up for grabs were in those traditional Republican areas. And what's amazing about the Republican performance yesterday is the Republicans had 15 seats up for grabs. There were 3 of them that looked like they were going to be at risk to them. The Democrats, on the other hand, had 21 seats up for grabs. I have on here that there were 12 at risk. You could argue Virginia came in there late yesterday. That certainly no one saw that coming. There were 13 seats that the Democrats had at risk. And when we go to the next slide, you can see that in the Democratic section, the Democrats picked up no Republican seats in the Senate. So the Republicans were able to beat back Democratic challenges in Kentucky. The Mitch McConnell, Allison Grimes contest certainly got a lot of attention in the media. I was fooled by some of the poll results going into yesterday. Mitch McConnell handily was able to win that race. The Democrats thought they had a pretty good shot there. When you look at Senator Chambliss retiring in Georgia, there was maybe an opportunity for the Democrats to pick that seat up. Again, there was talk maybe that race would go to a runoff, but David Perdue, again, relatively handily, different than what the polling was saying going into yesterday, was able to defeat Michelle Nunn. And then there was all talk about Kansas. Remember, Kansas came out of nowhere. Pat Roberts, a lot of controversy around him towards the end of the campaign, an independent candidate against him. Pat Roberts is able to defeat Greg Orman there. So the Democrats did not pick up any seats, which really was a disaster for them, because when you look at what happened to the Republicans last night, they executed almost flawlessly on their strategy of picking up specific Democratic seats that they targeted. Now, of the 7 seats that are up here, 5 of these states were part of the Republican Romney Road strategy, which was to go after seats where Governor Romney won that state in 2012 with the opportunity to pick up that Democratic seat in the Senate in 2014. There were 7 states in the Romney Road. It looks like the Republicans are going to win every single one of those states. Arkansas was in the Romney Road, Montana, North Carolina, which, again, defied the polling in North Carolina as we saw it. You looked at the polling yesterday. Kay Hagan looked like that was a state she was going to be able to win. Tom Tillis with a great close to be able to make that out. South Dakota and West Virginia, all 5 of those states, Governor Romney won. The Republicans were able to seize on that momentum from 2012 and take those seats. Colorado, that certainly was a shocker. Mark Udell ran really hard on certain issues that just didn't work. Watch out for Cory Gardner, by the way. Maybe not in 2016, but depending on what happens, Cory Gardner is one of the young rising stars of the Republican Party. Big win for him in Colorado. And lastly, Iowa, Joni Ernst. If you don't know who Joni Ernst is now, you're certainly going to get to know who she is. She's a very colorful character. You might have heard in her acceptance speech yesterday, she said she's going to go to Washington and make them squeal. She's really a colorful character. She's going to be something in the Senate. And she's the first woman from a woman senator from Iowa, so that's a big win for her. Again, the Republicans flawlessly executing a strategy there. And I'm going to make 2 calls here that you're not going to hear on the news right now. But Alaska, the votes are still coming in, but it looks like Dan Sullivan is going to be taking that seat from Mark Begich. That's another state in the Romney Road. Governor Romney won that in 2012. About 80% of the precincts have reported there, but obviously Alaska, they got to get all the votes from all the places. So we probably won't know that officially until next week, but I'm giving that over to the Republicans. In Louisiana, you might say, James, this seems weird because I read in the newspaper today that Mary Landry won the most percentage of votes in Louisiana. But remember, Louisiana is one of those weird states. They have the jungle primary type system where you have to win 50% of the vote. So even though she won 42% of the vote yesterday, Bill Cassidy won 41%. There was another third-party candidate. That's going to a runoff on December 6th. Almost all the polling says that when you poll Bill Cassidy versus Mary Landry, Bill Cassidy is going to win. So I've put Louisiana in the Republican side as well. And so that means, again, of those 7 states, that Romney Road that Republicans have been talking about for the last year and a half, the Republicans won all 7 of those Romney Road states, really defied almost everyone's predictions in terms of just how well they were able to do. And so now this is what the map looks like. Again, Alaska and Louisiana, you'll have to work with me on this, and I've already switched those over to the Republicans. But now the Republicans have a 54-seat majority in the Senate, and the Democrats are down to 46 seats, basically almost flipping what it was yesterday, 55-45. Now we're at 54-46. I just want to say one thing before we go look to 2016. There's going to be a lot of talk about who's to blame for the Democratic challenges. And the purpose of this call is not Democrats are good or Republicans are bad or Republicans are good or Democrats are bad. But just to put in a little bit of perspective, this was not an unusual loss in the Senate in particular for the Democrats. So if you go back to Dwight Eisenhower and you look at presidents that have, or parties I should say, that have been in office for 6 straight years in the Oval Office. So they won the first term, and now there's a second straight term. This 6th year is a very difficult year for most of those incumbent parties. They generally do lose seats in the Senate. So the record for this over the last 60 years or so is Dwight Eisenhower. The Republicans lost 12 seats during his 6th term. Really the only one who sort of escaped this was President Clinton in his 6th year. But it looks like looks like President Obama is going to lose 9 seats under his watch on that 6th term. A little bit higher than average. You're averaging about 6 seats that the incumbents party would lose. President Obama is going to lose 9 seats under his watch. Again, you're going to hear a lot of blame that this is President Obama's fault, or this shows some challenges that the Democratic Party have. I'm not saying I agree or disagree with anything of that, but just realize that in that 6th year that the same party's been in the Oval Office, it's really hard for them to hold on to seats. So historically, it's not a trend that we certainly haven't seen before. So now we sort of understand what happened yesterday, and certainly we've heard a lot about it on the news, and it's been digested over the last few hours. We're going to hear more and more as we move forward. But I think this illustrates one of the challenges that the Republicans have around the Affordable Care Act. Now, we're going to talk specifically about the Affordable Care Act in a moment. But what you might hear on MSNBC, as far left as you can go, or Fox News, as far right as you can go, that this means there's going to be major changes for the Affordable Care Act. But I want you to think about 2 things when you hear that on the news. And the first is, let's think about 2016 for a minute. Because we have to remember that Republicans now have 54 seats. Well, that's great, but to get legislation on the floor of the Senate, you need 60 votes. It's these weird procedural rules that we have in our Senate that you need 60 votes to get a vote. Yeah, you need 51 to get something passed, but you need 60 votes to get a vote. So what some Republican strategists, I should say, are starting to think about is, okay, the Republicans have the House, the Republicans have the Senate. Maybe 2014, 2015, there aren't going to be major changes to the Affordable Care Act. Many Republican strategists are looking to 2016. And part of the reason why they feel like 2016 could potentially be the year where there is a Republican in the Oval Office is if you look back again historically over the last 6 or 7 times that the incumbents party has been in there for 2 straight terms, it's really hard for that same party to win once again. So, for example, Dwight Eisenhower wins 2 terms. The next race, Senator Kennedy wins. Then we have Senator Kennedy and Governor Johnson, Johnson in there. All of a sudden, President Nixon comes in. Again, it goes from the Republicans to the Democrats to Republicans. The only time this hasn't happened since Dwight Eisenhower is with President Reagan. So President Reagan's in there, and then we have George Bush the first after him. But again, when you look at the trends, it's not out of the realm of possibility, just from a trending perspective, why the Republicans are so excited for 2016, because they feel like this is a good opportunity. It's a little bit of getting tired with the same party being in the Oval Office. Maybe now it's time for that change to come through. So the Republicans are very excited about 2016, but you have to wonder, if it's Hillary Clinton that's the Democratic nominee, does she have something that maybe past Democrats haven't had when they were running? Think back to 2000. President Clinton did not campaign that hard for Vice President Gore. He certainly was there, but he was coming off some of the Monica Lewinsky controversy. When he left office, he was still popular, but wasn't a huge campaigner for Vice President Gore. Well, here's the amazing thing. Since 1996, there are 7 states that voted for President Clinton in 1996 that have not voted for a Democratic presidential nominee since then. So one thing that the Republican strategists are a little concerned about is, if it is Hillary Clinton, are there states that Democrats have had little to no success in since 1996 that now all of a sudden come back into play? Kentucky, Louisiana, Missouri, Arizona, Arkansas, Tennessee, and West Virginia. These are states that Democrats haven't been able to win that presidential election since Bill Clinton. If it's Hillary Clinton that's the Democratic nominee, could the Bill Clinton factor come into play? Now, there's a lot of controversy around this because, as everyone knows, in this particular election, President Obama didn't do that much campaigning. Certainly his popularity isn't as high as it was prior to about a year and a half or 2 years ago when you go back to the 2012 election. President Obama sat on the sidelines generally. And really the surrogates for the Democratic Party in this particular election cycle were Elizabeth Warren, up here in Massachusetts where I am, Hillary Clinton, and President Clinton. And you could certainly argue that with the results that we saw yesterday, maybe that Clinton magic, maybe that Elizabeth Warren progressivism isn't as magical as some are pointing it out to be. But there are some on the Democratic side that felt that President Clinton and the campaigning that he did here was a dry run for him to get prepared for campaigning for Hillary for 2016. So again, it'd be interesting to see. Again, we're not even sure that Hillary Clinton would be the actual nominee for the Democrats, but potentially having a Clinton run in 2016 and using Bill Clinton as a campaigner to bring back some of those feelings back from the early to mid-'90s could maybe put some states into play for the Democrats that they just haven't had in really since President Clinton left office. Now, the other challenge that the Republicans have when they look to 2016, the biggest fear, in fact, of any Republican strategist today is today they hold the House, today they hold the Senate, and maybe they can win the Oval Office in 2016. But when you look at the slides here, the number of seats that have to be defended have flipped from 2014 to 2016. And in 2016, just the way the map falls, the Republicans have more seats to defend than the Democrats do. And when we take this a step further, the map for the Democrats in 2014 was not a good map. The map for the Republicans in 2016 is not a good map. Because in 2014, the Republicans executed flawlessly on their Romney Road strategy, win seats in states that voted for Governor Romney in 2012. Well, in 2016, the Democrats are going to have an Obama Road strategy. Not only that, when you look at these 10 seats, and we'll do this in a moment, the Democrats are putting up some of the safest seats that they have to get reelected in 2016. So when you look at here, these are the number of states where President Obama won by more than 15% in 2012. So that means that the Democrats in 2016, they're going to be able to say, okay, we have 7 Democratic senators running in states that President Obama won by more than 15%. Oh, and there's one Republican in Illinois who has to run the state that President Obama won by more than 15%. Then when you look at states that President Obama won by more than 5%, there's 3 Democrats that will be running in those states, but there's 4 Republicans that will have to be up for re-election in states where President Obama certainly didn't win in a landslide, but won relatively handily. And then there's 2 other states, Florida and Ohio, always states that are very, very, very hard for any president to win, whether you're a Democrat or Republican. Those states are always the ones that are coming right down to the wire. Again, those are states where President Obama won just by a margin in 2016, but the Democrats will invest a lot of time in figuring out how can they win back a net of 5 seats in 2016 so that they're able to retake back control of the Senate. And again, the biggest fear of the Republicans today is that the way that the map falls in 2016, even if they win the presidential cycle in 2016, that the Senate would move back to the Democrats. Now, again, there's a lot that has to happen until that 2016 cycle. But don't think that the Senate majority is locked up for 2016 at all. Again, it looks just as bad for the Republicans in 2016 as potentially it looked, just from a geographic perspective, as it did for the Democrats this year. So now we sort of set the stage of we know what happened in 2014. We know what happened yesterday. We have sort of an idea that maybe the Republicans are in control now of the Senate, but could go back into play in 2016. They have a great chance of winning, certainly just from what the trends would tell us for the 2016 presidential election. But tomorrow, you're meeting with a client. You're talking to your employees. What do you tell them that the effect of yesterday's election will mean for the future of the Affordable Care Act? And I think it's really important for context is that open enrollment is starting next week, in 2 weeks, on November 15th. And even that was a very political issue because remember, what's happened now is rather than having open enrollment begin on October 1st, which it did last year, which would have been prior to the elections, for a number of different reasons, that date was moved to after the elections on November 15th. And the Congressional Budget Office, and you can argue with me, quibble with me a little bit on these numbers, but these numbers all come from the government. By 2024, the Congressional Budget Office is projecting that 25 million Americans are going to get their health insurance through the individual exchanges, run through the federal government or the state government, or the states. Now we know as of today, and the number was about 8 million were enrolled after open enrollment closed, but with sort of the general churn that we'll get, there's around 7.1 million Americans today that are enrolled on the individual exchanges. Well, Well, open enrollment 2015, which begins on November 15th, that is supposed to add an additional 6 to 7 million Americans. So at the end of 2015, the Congressional Budget Office is projecting that we're going to have 13 million Americans receiving their health care through the individual exchanges either run by the state or the federal government. So there's a lot riding on this particular open enrollment where we almost have to double the number of folks that purchased insurance through open enrollment in 2014. And so this has some challenges for the Republicans, because whatever you think about the Affordable Care Act, whether you like the Affordable Care Act or you don't like the Affordable Care Act, by the time that the new senators are confirmed in Washington, are sworn into office in Washington, there's going to be maybe 13 million Americans that are on the individual exchanges getting their health insurance. So it makes it more difficult to change the legislation, to change the individual exchanges when you have tens of millions of Americans getting their coverage because of the Affordable Care Act. On top of that, and I mentioned this a minute earlier, on top of that, the Republicans only have 54 seats, which is certainly a very, very healthy majority. But because of the rules of the Senate, they don't have enough to just put whatever legislation on the floor that they want. And even a few days ago, Senator McConnell really, and he had to walk back these comments because of some and farther right on his party were very unhappy with him, essentially said they're not going to repeal the Affordable Care Act. He said he'd like to go at it and sort of take it apart piece by piece. But in terms of a full repeal, even with the majority that he thought would be coming, he didn't think it would be possible for repeal. Again, he had to walk those comments back, and if you saw Rand Paul yesterday, who wasn't up for re-election but certainly seemed to be everywhere in Kentucky and was on all the almost all the news broadcasts, he said something totally different. He said the first thing we have to do with the majority is to put legislation on the floor that's going to repeal the Affordable Care Act. That's really the challenge the Republicans have. There's been 50 bills that have come from the House that would have major changes to the Affordable Care Act. Very few of them made it to the floor of the Senate because the Democrats wouldn't let them there, because the Republicans couldn't figure out how to get the 60 votes. It seems unlikely that you're going to see 6 Democrats join with the Republicans to have 54 plus 6, meaning 60 senators saying we want to see a full repeal of the Affordable Care Act move forward. So instead, and you're starting to see this leak out a little bit from Republicans today, Republicans are starting to signal, well, maybe we'll go after some low-hanging fruit that may be bipartisan. There'll be some bipartisan agreement on repealing pieces of the Affordable Care Act. So a perfect example of that is last night, one of the first things you started hearing out of some Republican circles is the medical device tax. That's something that raises about $10 billion a year every year. It's certainly not a huge revenue number for the federal government. It's something that maybe Democrats and Republicans could both get behind as some sort of compromise of changing the Affordable Care Act. It works for the Republicans because they're able to go back to their constituency and say, see, we're taking apart the law piece by piece. It works for the Democrats, though, almost just as well, because they're able to go back to their constituency and say, see, we're willing to reach across the aisle and work with the Republicans to make the Affordable Care Act better. So I think you're going to see smaller things like that. And in fact, you could argue that if the Republicans want to prove that they're the party that can unite both Democrats and Republicans over different pieces of legislation, maybe they leave the Affordable Care Act alone for now and go for some quick wins. And what I mean by that is there are some things that have bipartisan support. Keystone Pipeline, for example. I know President Obama is certainly not a supporter of that, but with the new majority in the Senate, there are enough Democrats that would vote for the Keystone Pipeline where it is very possible that will pass both the House, now also the Senate, and go to President Obama. If it goes with bipartisan support from the Senate, even with just it'll have to be at least 6 Democrats on board, but with 6 to 10 Democrats that are on board, it's going to make it very difficult for President Obama to veto that. Now, not saying that he wouldn't, but again, this is something that would show Democrats and Republicans working together. We've certainly heard a lot in the news about corporate inversions. That's something that the administration wants to get changed. Republicans want to get changed, and Democrats want to get changed. So could we see legislation, again, outside of the ACA that shows both parties could work together? Another thing I heard last night, Rand Paul is certainly leading the charge for this, is should domestic corporations that have money overseas be able to repatriate that money back to the United States with some type of tax holiday, with the idea being that they would then use those funds to create jobs and invest in their companies. That seems to have some level of bipartisan support as well. So again, there are some changes potentially to the Affordable Care Act. If you go piece by piece, you can find places that maybe Democrats and Republicans agree. Maybe there's a tweak to the 30-hour full-time employee rule. But I've had the opportunity to travel all over the country this year, and certainly when I'm talking to brokers, consultants, business owners, those that are the most conservative were saying to me, I can't wait until the Republicans have control of the Senate, because then they're going to be able to repeal the Affordable Care Act. And I've had to try to walk them back from that step of it's just not that simple. If the Republicans control the Oval Office in 2016, and they control the Senate, and they control the House, there's a much better likelihood that they'd be able to make major fundamental changes to the Affordable Care Act. But over the next 2 years, you still have President Obama in the White House, and he's not going to sign legislation that significantly changes the law. Tweaking it, maybe going from 30 to 35 or 40 hours, maybe something like that's palatable. Again, the medical device tax, maybe that's something that he'd be willing to sign. But major fundamental changes over the next year and a half, 2 years, just aren't things that seem extremely realistic. But the thing is, on Monday, next Monday, you could argue, and I am going to argue, that what happens next Monday is more important to the future of the Affordable Care Act than what happened yesterday. Because next Monday, what's going to happen is the Supreme Court is going to decide what to do with the Halbig versus Burwell case. Now, the King versus Burwell case. Now, you might remember, these are those two cases. They came out a few months ago. It was that crazy day where 1 minute we thought no one could get subsidies, and then the next minute everyone could get subsidies. Really just an amazing thing where the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals and the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals both released their opinions just hours apart. But this is that controversial sentence that if you want to get a tax subsidy or credit, you have to be on an exchange that's established by the state. And why Monday is so important is the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. That was the second case that came out that day. The Fourth Circuit has said, by a 3-0 decision, whether you're on a state-run exchange or a federally run exchange, you are eligible for a tax credit or subsidy. So what they've done is they've said the IRS, as an administrative body, they can read that sentence that's on the top of the page there. Through an exchange established by the state under Section 1311, they've read that, the IRS has, and said that actually means state exchange and federal exchange. The Fourth Circuit said that's right. The IRS has that ability to make that interpretation. Well, what King's decided to do is she's appealed it to the U.S. Supreme Court. And this week, and it's very rare that we sort of get this glimpse of it, the Supreme Court read it over on last Friday. All the petitions of whether they should hear it or not hear it. And they didn't make a decision as to whether they were going to hear the case or not. But what they did say is this Friday, they were going to look at the case one more time. And so we'll know on Monday if they're going to take the King case or if they're not going to take the King case. Now, some inside baseball stuff on the Supreme Court. A lot of Supreme Court insiders feel like the Supreme Court is going to take that case because through some crazy sort of unwritten rule, when the Supreme Court conferences and they look at what cases they're going to take, usually the first time they look at a case, they don't take it. But if they're going to take it, they'll say, well, we'll look at it a second time and really decide. So a lot of Supreme Court insiders feel like next Monday we are going to find out that the Supreme Court is going to rule on whether only state-run exchanges can issue tax credits or subsidies, or whether both federal and state-run exchanges can issue tax credits or subsidies. And the reason why you care about this is maybe you don't do a lot of work with the individual exchanges, is that ruling has massive impacts on the employer mandate. I would argue that the employer mandate cannot survive if only state-run exchanges are eligible to issue tax credits or subsidies. And the reason for that is most states, 36 states, have federally run exchanges. And so that would mean that about 4.5 million Americans that are getting their health insurance, this is just this year, this doesn't even count the 2015 open enrollment, 4.5 million Americans that are getting their insurance through the individual exchanges run by the federal government, 4.5 million of them are getting tax credits or subsidies. That would mean all of those tax credits or subsidies go away, and generally speaking, those people wouldn't be able to afford insurance. Why you care about that is if you live in one of those 36 states, if you're in Wisconsin, for example, which has a federally run exchange, Wisconsin has a federally run exchange. The only way you trigger the employer mandate penalty is you don't offer insurance, or you offer health insurance that's unaffordable. And then one of your employees goes on to one of the exchanges, and then they get a tax credit, and then they buy insurance through the exchange. Well, if you offered coverage to me, and I didn't qualify for a tax credit or subsidy, and I went on the exchange and purchased coverage, I don't matter to your employer mandate issues. So in those 36 states that wouldn't be able to issue tax credits or subsidies because they're using federally run exchange, the employer mandate is not applicable to employees who live in those states. Now, I've said this before. You could argue, when you think about that for a minute, again, I'm going to use Wisconsin as my example. Texas, I mean, in 36 states. If I'm in Wisconsin or I'm in Texas and I'm a Texas employer, well, this is pretty good for me all of a sudden, because now I cannot trigger the employer mandate with my Texas employees who live in Texas, because none of them are going to be eligible for a tax credit or subsidy, so there's no $2,000 fine, there's no $3,000 fine. But think of all the work that you've done with your clients, that you've done in HR to get ready for the mandates, making sure you're offering coverage. It might be better for more employees if they're in states that can't offer tax credits or subsidies. It's just more work for all of us to figure out just what the compliance is around that. So certainly the election is a huge deal for the Affordable Care Act, but the really big deal is what happens on Monday. Because if the Supreme Court does not decide to hear that case, the rule of the land is both federally run exchanges and state-run exchanges are able to offer tax credits. So I just got a question in, and this is a fair one, so I'll address it. Monday is when the court decides if they're going to hear the case. Then there's a whole other level of they'd hear the case maybe in January or February, and then it would take months. We probably wouldn't know the actual decision until June. So Monday we'll know if they're going to hear the case. June is when we'll know what the actual ruling is. But then that brings us down to something else you have to watch, because next month there's going to be another huge ruling coming from D.C., where the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals is going to rule on Halbig versus Burwell. Now, this is the case that came out that morning that said only state-run exchanges can offer tax credits or subsidies. And through very shrewd political maneuvers, rather than appealing that case to the Supreme Court, what the Obama administration asked is what happened in the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. Only 3 judges heard the case, and there's actually 13 judges that actually make up the entire D.C. Circuit. Justice is blind. I'm not saying just because you're a Republican or a Democrat you vote one way or another. But in that 2-1 decision, the 2 judges that voted that only state-run exchanges can offer subsidies were Republican appointees, and the 1 judge who voted that state and federal were Democratic appointees. What the Obama administration decided to do, and it was smart if you think about it, they asked the full Court of Appeals to hear the case. They said, instead of just 3 judges, we want all 13 judges to listen to this. And the reason why they did that is of those 13 judges, 8 of them Democratic appointees, 5 of them Republican presidential appointees. Again, I'm not saying just because you're a Democrat or a Republican you vote one way or another, but certainly you can see sort of the ideas behind that. Most insiders feel like when the full D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals rules, they're going to say both federal and state exchanges should be able to offer tax credits or subsidies. So again, there's a lot of stuff going on in the judiciary that I would argue is more important in the short term over the next 2 years than even really what's happening on the political side of things. So just last thing to sum up on this slide, Monday we'll find out if the Supreme Court is going to hear the King versus Burwell case. And if they do, that's very, very important. We pay attention to what the ruling is in June. If they don't, we still want to watch December 17th. Will be oral arguments down in D.C. on the Halbig versus Burwell case, and we'll probably get that decision or January or February. So again, a lot of stuff in the judiciary happening. You could certainly argue is maybe even more important than some of the political things. So I know I've talked about a lot in a very short period of time, but I just want to sum up here, and then I'll take some questions because we've got some excellent ones that have come in so far. But make no mistake, there are changes in the Senate. The Republicans, when all the dust settles, will have 54-seat majority in the Senate, which is very, very important. But this is not the majority that the Democrats had in 2007 when they had 60 votes and could do basically whatever they wanted. It's still a very, very healthy majority, but the Republicans will have to work within the system and work with Democrats to get things done. 2016, if you don't like political advertisements this year, $100 million, by the way, was spent in just the North Carolina Senate race alone. This year was the most expensive midterms of all time. The midterms this year, almost as much money was spent as was in the entire 2012 campaign season, which included presidential elections. So if you don't like political commercials, 2016, you might want to get just DVR everything, because 2016 is going to have more, leading up to that is going to have more political commercials, because this is where the Republicans feel like they have a real chance to potentially control all three areas: the Senate, the House, and the President in the Oval Office. And the Democrats are going to do whatever they can to maybe take back the Senate, because they think there's some vulnerable seats there. And then lastly, we spent a lot of time on this. The judiciary, over the next couple of weeks, they could maybe have bigger impact on the future of the ACA than even what we've seen from the political side of things. So with that, I'm going to open up for questions. I know you can't say them, but you can type them in, and I've seen some come through. So I'm going to answer just a few very quickly, and then I'll take the other ones that have come in. This is a very interesting question. Someone asked me about Rand Paul, and the question is, will Rand Paul run for president in 2016, and what does that mean for his Senate seat? That's a great question, because what happened last night in Kentucky was, yes, Mitch McConnell really outpaced what many people he just won by more than anyone thought he would. A lot of folks thought Allison Grimes would be able to perform better than she did, and the polls were seemed closer than what actually happened. What's interesting about this, though, is Rand Paul, although he wasn't running this year, was campaigning very hard in Kentucky for state legislators. Why? Well, the state legislature in Kentucky is controlled by Democrats. There's a Democratic governor there as well. There's a law in Kentucky that says you can't run for two things at the same time. Well, Rand Paul is up for re-election in 2016. So he's going to run for president. I mean, I don't think anyone would doubt that right now. But his campaigning for Kansas legislator seats inside of Kansas didn't work. So it's still a democratically controlled legislature in Kentucky. Excuse me, I said Kansas, but I meant Kentucky. Basically what that means is Rand Paul was hoping he could get enough people elected that they would change the law in Kentucky so that he could run simultaneously for president and to defend his Senate seat. Well, if Rand Paul runs in 2016, he's not going to be able to run for a Senate seat. The Democrats do not have a strong bench in Kentucky in terms of for something on the national scale. Allison Grimes is 35. She's the attorney general there, although she really campaigned extremely well in the beginning and sort of faltered towards the end. She had a really tough question where they asked her who she voted for in 2008 and 2012, and she wouldn't say. That didn't seem to make a lot of sense to people. And then some of her campaign staffers were caught on secret recordings saying that she was just saying that she was pro-coal and she actually wasn't. So she made some stumbles towards the end, but there is some thought that if Rand Paul doesn't run in 2016 and she's not running against someone that's really established, maybe Allison Grimes comes back in 2016. Maybe the Democrats can steal a seat there. If Rand Paul decides he is going to run for president. Another question says, does the 54-seat majority include Louisiana and Alaska? And the answer is absolutely yes. So I could be wrong on this. So it is possible that instead of the 54-46 that I've told you a number of times in the call, it could be 52-48, best case scenario for the Democrats. But any way it falls, worst case scenario for the Republicans is they have 52 seats. And if Alaska and Louisiana break, basically the way that it looks like the polling is going to, that they're going, the Republicans are going to have 52 seats regardless, but it could potentially be 54. Okay, I have an angry question here from someone saying that even if the GOP was in the White House, there's no way that they could do away with the ACA. Now with 20 million enrolled via the exchanges, many of which would have subsidies, it's an absolute political nightmare. It's a very good question. So if it's 2016, and this is where you could really argue, and again, I don't say I like the ACA, not that I do or don't like the ACA. This is nonpartisan, straight down the middle. But if you really think about where the Republicans might have missed their biggest chance to make major fundamental changes to the Affordable Care Act, it's probably with Governor Romney in 2012. Because we don't have the exchanges up and running at that point, then there's really things that can be taken back. If there's 13 or 14 million Americans that are enrolled on the exchanges by 2016, that's a very low number that I'm giving you there. It does make it more difficult for the Republicans to unwind the law. The thing is, when you ask that exact question to Paul Ryan, or Congressman Ryan, he says it's not, because what the Republicans are putting forward is plans that would create something similar to the individual exchanges, something similar to tax credits and subsidies for lower-income Americans. What they really want to get rid of is the employer and the individual mandate. That's really what they're there's other things I want to get rid of too, don't get me wrong. But that's really what the crux of the matter for them. And what's interesting is Senator Coburn's retiring. I think Senator Coburn, Republican from Oklahoma, had put forward the best Republican alternative to the Affordable Care Act. And it really underscores the challenge the Republicans have in repealing the law. And for those of you on the phone, the change would affect your business, because most of the Republican plans, including Senator Coburn's, say that they would change the taxation of employer-provided health insurance. And those funds would be used to replace some of the lost revenue from repealing the individual and employer mandate. So everyone understands that the toothpaste is out of the tube. There's no way to sort of rewind the healthcare system back to where it was, and you have to have some type of exchange-type mechanism out there where folks can go that don't get coverage, and maybe there's some tax credits or subsidies. It's how you pay for it is really the question. And what Senator Coburn's plan is, and if any of you want to see it, email me. I'll send you it out. It's a 6-page PDF, and so it's not all the details, but it's well thought out. Is today, Sun Life pays $1 for my health insurance. It's 100% income tax-free to me. Well, under Senator Coburn's plan, Sun Life would pay $1 for my health insurance, 65 cents income tax-free, 35 cents added to my W-2 at the end of the year, taxed to me at my ordinary income tax rates. I'd pay my Social Security taxes on it, my Medicare taxes, and my ordinary income and state taxes as well. The employer, under Senator Coburn's plan, would still be able to deduct the full $1, but I, as the employee, wouldn't be able to get the full tax benefit. That would fundamentally change the employee benefits business as a whole, but that's one way the Republicans are saying, okay, we're going to keep no pre-existing conditions. We're going to do some of the things that are very popular within the law. We don't like the individually employer mandate, but we have to make up some of those revenue numbers. So again, it's not as easy sometimes as some of the Republicans are putting out there in terms of how easy it would be potentially to sort of unwind the Affordable Care Act. Question here, this is a great question, about my Clinton factor. Demographics and some of the changing values within those demographics, couldn't those outweigh the Clinton factor? Absolutely. Whether you like President Clinton or not, it's hard to argue over his ability to campaign. He's a good campaigner. And so a lot of folks wonder, it's a fair question, have the demographics of those states and values of those states changed since 1996? Yeah, quite possibly. I'm not saying that the Democrats would be able to win all those states if Hillary Clinton is the nominee. But generally speaking, when you look at presidential politics over the last 8, 12 years, there's only like 5 states that matter. It's, can I win Pennsylvania? Can I win Ohio? Which is, if I can win Michigan, that would be great. I was going to be very important for me, and I got to win Florida too. Well, that's really the board for the Democrats, because they know they're going to win California, they're going to win the whole left coast, they're going to win most of New England. They're going to win New York. There's just a certain number of states that they have to battle at. If President Clinton could expand the map, that would be a big deal. Now, on the flip side, you could argue that Cory Gardner's win yesterday in Colorado, that puts Colorado back on the map potentially for the Republicans. It was a very Republican state until the last few election cycles. North Carolina is another great example of a state that went for President Obama in 2008, flipped back to Governor Romney in 2012. That's going to be another that's going to be another very, very difficult state for both sides. Okay, but another question here. They're coming in fast and furious. Given that many Democrats have publicly distanced themselves from Obamacare, their words, not mine, is there any likelihood that there are 14 Democrats that could vote with the Republicans to overturn a presidential veto? Geez, I don't know. See, again, you have to look at the politics of what the Democrats are going through. If I'm a Senate Democrat in 2016, I'm really not worried, because the 10 Senate Democrats that are up for re-election in 2016 are all in pretty safe places. They're in very established Democratic areas where the Democratic nominee, probably whoever it is, whether it's President Clinton or Hillary Clinton, or if it's Elizabeth Warren or maybe someone that kind of comes out of nowhere, is probably going to win pretty handily. So I don't think there are enough Democrats that are willing to come out and say, now that the 2014 cycle is over, now that we go to the new 2016, 2018 cycles, I don't think there are enough Democrats that feel like they have an opportunity to come out and say, if President Obama wants to override a veto or wants to veto something, we're going to join with the Republicans to override that veto. The other thing to remember, too, is there's a big division in the Republican Party, and this is why Mitch McConnell had to walk back some of its comments. You have some hardline Republicans on the right that want today, or January 7th, after everyone's sworn in, they want the first thing that's on the Senate docket is having everyone publicly on the record voting for or against the Affordable Care Act, whether it's even just to vote. So I voted against even voting on having the Affordable Care Act come up again. But then you have some that are a little bit more to the center, which Mitch McConnell is trying to decide what type of leader he wants to be, that is saying, is that the most effective use of the Republican power? If it really isn't likely that the Affordable Care Act is actually going to be completely overturned, is it worthwhile to have that vote, more so maybe even just for more so just as sort of a symbolic type vote? Great question on the judiciary here. So if the employer mandate goes away, which I just said it possibly would be harder to enforce if there's 36 states that don't have any tax credits or subsidies, the employer mandate goes away, how will the subsidies get paid for? Well, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Dr. Jonathan Gruber. He's MIT guy, absolutely brilliant, helped build the Affordable Care Act here, or the Romney Care, if you will, in Massachusetts, and was a very close policy advisor to President Obama. And he's on, it was a sort of an off the record, but it was taped, but he talked about why the law is written as it is. And in his estimation, the reason why you had to have a state-run exchange is that was to force each state to create their own state-run exchange, and the stick for not creating that state-run exchange would be you get no tax credits or subsidies. So what those 36 states would have to figure out, Kentucky's actually perfect, because yesterday Rand Paul, I'm not picking on Rand Paul, it's just I was watching a million things with him in it yesterday. There's about 500,000 people that are on the Kentucky exchange. It's working very well, it's including their Medicaid expansion. Rand Paul is talking about completely repealing the Affordable Care Act. Well, how does that play in Kentucky when you have 500,000 people that are getting coverage through this? So the other way to think about it is if I'm in a state that doesn't have a state-run exchange but a federally run exchange, even if I don't like the Affordable Care Act, would I be willing to create a state-run exchange on June 15th if the Supreme Court on June 14th said, you know what, you have to have a state-run exchange? Would I be willing to do that just because I want the people in my state, the people that are going to vote for me for governor, am I going to be willing to make some changes? I think what some Democrats were hoping yesterday is that you'd see sort of a wave of Democratic governorships happen in states that hadn't expanded their Medicaid program, and quite frankly, that this didn't happen. So now in the states that haven't expanded their Medicaid program, you still have the same Republican or a different Republican in that office. So again, it makes it less likely that state would expand their Medicaid program. So is it the Supreme Court that forces some Republican state legislatures to take a look back and say, geez, if we don't do this, there's going to be 500,000 or 1 million people in our state that are getting a subsidy today that are going to lose it tomorrow because we have a federally run exchange. So there's a lot of moving parts. But to answer your question, it becomes very difficult for the government to fund the tax credits or subsidies if the employer mandate doesn't kick in 2016. And even this year, with the employer mandate being phased in, I get questions all the time if the employer mandate will be delayed. The Democrats need the employer mandate for revenue. This booked revenue that the CBO is projecting into the future based on some ideas of how many employers will drop coverage. Now, we could certainly debate with the government over how many employers are actually going to drop coverage and pay the mandate penalties or the fines, but there's numbers on the books that the CBO is running the budget off of, so we have to respect those numbers. But again, we'll see. But I think it's harder for the Democrats to keep pushing things off because they need to have some of this revenue that's being marked on the books come in. That's why something like the medical device tax, I'm not saying $10 billion is nothing, but it's definitely something. It's definitely something that we can. It's definitely something that Democrats can get behind because $10 billion is not a huge thing. So we're going to take one last question here, and I think this is this is really putting me on the spot, but I'm willing to do it. So it says you made a prediction on Alaska and Louisiana, which I have, but that's not fair because like half the votes are already in, so it wasn't that much of a prediction. But how about a winner of the 2016 presidential election? Oh man, this is tough. I don't know. I think the Republicans have a lot of great candidates that they could run, and you really saw that yesterday. One guy to look at is John Kasich in Ohio. He's someone you're not hearing a lot about. Ohio's so important to the presidential cycle, and he just destroyed the Democratic candidate there. It wasn't a very well-run campaign. Rick Perry, who you think back a few years ago, there was sort of a mistake there in the debate when he forgot what he was talking about, which I can completely understand. But what's amazing about him is he's been very in demand during these midterms. He's been everywhere. Rick Perry has literally been everywhere. He's not the governor anymore. And he's a little more likable than he was in 2012 somehow. I don't know how, but he seems to have learned a lot from that cycle. Ted Cruz, that's really where I think some of the hardline Republicans are going to want a Ted Cruz or Rand Paul type. Scott Walker, I don't want to forget him. I mean, look, this guy has run 3 races in the last 4 years in Wisconsin. He won in, was it 2013 or 2012, and he's a recall in 2013, then he wins again this year. He's won 3 races over the last few years. He's a real strong candidate. That's a state that the Republicans have had challenges winning, even with Paul Ryan last year. So, God, I don't want to weasel out of this question, but I think it's going to be tough. Let me put it this way. I predict it's going to be I do think Hillary Clinton is going to make it for the Democrats, and I think Scott Walker, Hillary Clinton. I don't know who wins. It's going to be too close to call. But before I wrap up completely, I just want to say, first of all, thank you. What we're going to do is send out all the slides that we had here. But when you're sort of thinking about what do you do tomorrow, so you have all this information. What are you going to do tomorrow as you're talking to your employees or your clients? For those of you that are brokers or consultants on the phone, I think it's important to let your clients know things are changing. What you hear on Fox News or MSNBC might not be exactly what's going to happen because they're probably not hearing a lot about the Supreme Court thing that actually could hold a lot more weight than the actual changes. In terms of major changes to the Affordable Care Act over the next 2 years, I'm seeing small tweaks, nothing substantial. The Supreme Court stuff could have sort of a bigger, or will have a bigger play. And as you're talking to employees, they have no idea. They're just watching TV, Fox News, and they're, geez, what does this mean? Are my health insurance premiums going to go up or they go down? What is my employer going to offer me? And I think it's important to just be honest that regardless of whether the Affordable Care Act was in place or not, every single year the cost of health insurance goes up. And so working with employees, it's important to create those employee benefit package that has products that they can pay for, whether it's life, disability type products, the health insurance that they're going to pay for. It's important to just let them know that you're aware of what's going on in Washington and you understand how it's affecting them and the benefits that you offer. If you have any questions I didn't get to, and there were a number of them, please feel free to email me. As I mentioned, the deck and the recording will go out. But thank you. We've got great attendance for this. We certainly appreciate your partnership here at Sun Life, and I hope you have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, this does conclude our conference call for today. We thank you for your participation. Now disconnect your lines and have a great day.